Imagine conquering an empire so vast that it stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. Now imagine that this empire wasn't just built on military conquest, but on the most sophisticated economic system the medieval world had ever seen. Before we begin, if you're fascinated by how empires accumulate massive wealth and dominate the world through economic power, hit that subscribe button for Empire of Wealth. We explore the forces that built history's greatest civilizations. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, controlled roughly 24 million square kilometers. That's 16% of the Earth's total land area. But size alone didn't make them rich. What made the Mongols the wealthiest empire in history was something far more revolutionary. They understood that true wealth doesn't come from hoarding gold. It comes from controlling the flow of trade itself. This is the story of how nomadic warriors from the steppes of Mongolia built an economic superpower that would reshape global commerce forever. When Genghis Khan began his conquests in 1206, he wasn't just building a military empire, he was executing the greatest economic strategy in medieval history, monopolizing the Silk Road. The Silk Road wasn't a single road. It was a vast network of trade routes connecting East Asia to the Mediterranean. For centuries, these routes had been fragmented, controlled by dozens of competing kingdoms, each charging their own taxes, their own bribes, their own tolls. A merchant traveling from China to Europe might pass through 20 different territories. At each border, they paid. At each city, they paid. By the time silk from China reached European markets, its price had increased 10 times over. Not because of the silk itself, but because of the cost of moving it through a fractured world. Genghis Khan saw the inefficiency and recognized the opportunity. If one power controlled the entire route, they could guarantee safe passage, standardize taxation, and facilitate trade on an unprecedented scale. They wouldn't just tax caravans once. They'd tax the entire flow of goods between civilizations. So he conquered everything in between. By 1279, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Korean peninsula to the gates of Vienna. Every major trade route between east and west passed through Mongol-controlled territory. They had achieved something no empire before them had managed: a complete monopoly on transcontinental trade. But here's what made the Mongols truly revolutionary: they didn't just control trade. They actively promoted it. They established the Yam system, a network of postal stations and rest stops every 25 to 30 miles along major routes. Merchants could travel with guaranteed safety, fresh horses, food, and protection from bandits. The Mongols issued paisas, metal tablets that served as passports guaranteeing safe passage through the empire. With a paisa, a merchant could travel from Beijing to Baghdad without fear of robbery or arbitrary taxation. This was revolutionary. For the first time in history, transcontinental trade became predictable, safe, and profitable. The result: trade volumes exploded. Silk, spices, porcelain, precious metals, and ideas flowed at unprecedented rates. And the Mongols taxed every single transaction. But controlling trade routes was only the first part of the Mongol economic revolution. The second part was even more radical. They perfected the use of paper money. Paper currency had existed in China before the Mongols, but it was unreliable. Different regions used different currencies. Counterfeiting was rampant. Most merchants still preferred gold and silver because paper could become worthless overnight. Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, changed everything. In 1260, he introduced the Chow, a unified paper currency backed by the full authority of the Mongol state. This wasn't just Chinese innovation. This was the world's first truly successful fiat currency system. Here's what made it work. The Mongols made their paper money mandatory. All taxes had to be paid in Chow. All trade within the empire had to use Chow. Merchants entering Mongol territory were required to exchange their gold and silver for paper currency at designated government offices. If you refused to accept Chow as payment, the penalty was death. The Mongols didn't ask. They enforced. This sounds tyrannical, and it was. But it was also brilliant. By forcing everyone to use paper money, the Mongols created a unified monetary system across the largest empire in history. A merchant in Beijing used the same currency as a merchant in Samarkand. This eliminated exchange rate chaos and made long-distance trade infinitely simpler. But here's the genius part. Paper money costs almost nothing to produce. The Mongols could create currency simply by printing it. They collected taxes in paper they printed themselves, while accumulating massive reserves of actual gold and silver from merchant exchanges. Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire in the 1270s, was astonished by this system. He wrote that Kublai Khan had mastered the art of alchemy because he could create wealth from paper. In Europe, kings still relied on heavy gold coins. The Mongols had already moved beyond precious metals. The Chow system worked because it was backed by something stronger than gold, the absolute power and stability of the Mongol Empire. As long as the empire remained strong, the currency held value, and for nearly a century, it did. Drop a comment below. Do you think paper money or gold makes a better currency? Let's debate in the comments. Most conquerors throughout history made the same mistake. They destroyed what they conquered. Cities were burned, populations enslaved, economic infrastructure demolished. It was profitable in the short term but catastrophic in the long term. You can't tax ashes. The Mongols understood something their contemporaries didn't. Wealth isn't in the treasuries you loot. It's in the productive capacity you preserve. When Mongol armies approached a city, they offered a choice: surrender and prosper, or resist and be annihilated. Many cities chose surrender after witnessing what happened to those who resisted. But here's the key: cities that surrendered were treated remarkably well. The Mongols would install governors, establish clear tax rates, and then leave the existing economic system largely intact. Artisans kept working, merchants kept trading, farmers kept farming. The only difference was that a portion of everything now flowed to the Mongol state. The Mongol tax system was brutal by modern standards, but it was consistent and predictable. There were no surprise levies, no arbitrary confiscations, no corrupt officials inventing new taxes. The rates were set, everyone knew them, and they applied universally. This predictability was itself revolutionary. In medieval Europe, taxation was chaotic. Kings would demand whatever they could extract whenever they needed it. Nobles would add their own taxes. Church taxes came on top. A merchant never knew what they'd actually owe. Under Mongol rule, you knew. 10% of agricultural production. Specific customs duties on goods. Clear percentages on commercial transactions. Harsh, yes, but predictable, and in the medieval world, predictability meant you could plan. You could invest. You could build. The Mongols also protected artisans and skilled workers. When they conquered a city, they specifically spared craftsmen, engineers, scholars, and merchants. These people were too valuable to kill. They were relocated to Mongol cities where they could continue producing wealth for the empire. This wasn't mercy, it was economics. The Mongols recognized that human capital was as valuable as gold. A skilled craftsman could generate tax revenue for decades. Dead, they generated nothing. The result was an empire where economic activity flourished even under foreign rule. Trade volumes increased, cities grew, artisans thrived, and the Mongol treasury swelled with tax revenue from an economy they had conquered but deliberately preserved. Here's something that might surprise you. The Mongol Empire was one of the most religiously tolerant empires in medieval history. This wasn't because the Mongols were particularly enlightened or moral. It was because religious tolerance was good for business. In the 13th century, religion and trade were deeply intertwined. Muslim merchants dominated the Silk Road. Christian merchants controlled Mediterranean trade. Buddhist and Hindu merchants operated throughout Asia. Jewish merchants served as intermediaries across multiple regions. Most empires favored one religion over others. This meant alienating merchants from other faiths, disrupting trade networks, and losing tax revenue. The Mongols took a different approach. They favored no one and tolerated everyone. Genghis Khan's law code, the Yasa, explicitly protected religious freedom. Buddhist monks, Christian priests, Muslim imams, and Taoist sages all enjoyed exemption from taxes and military service. Mongol rulers attended religious ceremonies from multiple faiths, not because they believed in them, but because it demonstrated the universal authority. This wasn't just symbolic. Religious tolerance had direct economic benefits. When Muslim merchants knew they could trade safely in Mongol territory, they came. When Christian merchants knew their rights would be protected, they came. When Buddhist monasteries knew they wouldn't be destroyed, they preserved and grew wealth. The Mongols recognized that merchants brought wealth, and merchants came from all religious backgrounds. Alienating any group meant losing a portion of potential trade, so they didn't. This policy created something unprecedented. A cosmopolitan empire where Chinese engineers worked alongside Persian architects, where Muslim scholars debated with Buddhist monks, where Christian artisans sold to Jewish merchants. This diversity wasn't just cultural. It was economic innovation waiting to happen. Ideas spread faster in diverse environments. Technologies transfer when different cultures interact. The Mongol Empire became a crucible of innovation precisely because it brought together people who would never otherwise have met. Chinese gunpowder technology reached the Middle East and Europe through Mongol intermediaries. Persian astronomical knowledge spread to China. Indian mathematics traveled west. European metalworking techniques moved east. Every transfer of knowledge created new products, new efficiencies, new wealth. And the Mongols taxed all of it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into economic history, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps the algorithm show this to more people who love this kind of content. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was generating wealth at a scale the world had never seen. Tax revenue flowed from every corner of Eurasia. Trade volumes had increased exponentially. The Mongol capital cities, particularly Karakoram and later Khanbaliq, Beijing, became the richest cities on earth. But the very thing that made the Mongols rich also contained the seeds of the decline. The empire was too large to govern as one unit. After Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the empire began to fragment. The Golden Horde controlled Russia and Eastern Europe. The Ilkhanate ruled Persia and the Middle East. The Chagatai Khanate held Central Asia. The Yuan dynasty governed China. They were all technically Mongol empires, but they increasingly acted independently. As unity fractured, so did the economic system. The unified currency system broke down. Different khanates issued their own money. The yam system deteriorated without centralized maintenance. Banditry increased as central authority weakened. The safe, predictable trade routes that had made the Mongols rich became dangerous again. In China, Kublai Khan's successors made a fatal economic mistake. They printed too much paper money. Without the discipline of a strong central authority, they inflated the currency to pay for wars and luxuries. The Chow, which had held value for decades, began to collapse. By the 1350s, hyperinflation had destroyed confidence in Mongol currency. Merchants refused paper and demanded gold again. Sound familiar? The Mongols discovered what the Weimar Republic would learn 6 centuries later. Paper money only works when people trust the issuing authority. Once that trust erodes, paper becomes worthless. Political fragmentation led to economic fragmentation, which led to declining trade, which meant declining tax revenue, which weakened central authority further. It was a death spiral. The Black Death, which swept through Eurasia in the 1340s, delivered the final blow. The plague traveled along the same trade routes the Mongols had so carefully maintained. It killed millions, including huge portions of the populations in Mongol territories. Trade collapsed as cities emptied and caravans stopped moving. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty in China fell to the Ming Rebellion. The other khanates would persist for decades or even centuries in reduced forms, but the unified Mongol economic system was finished. The richest empire in history had collapsed not primarily from military defeat, but from the breakdown of the economic mechanisms that had generated its wealth in the first place. The Mongol Empire collapsed, but its economic innovations didn't die. They transformed the world. The Mongols proved that vast empires could be held together not just by military force, but by economic incentives. They showed that protecting trade generates more wealth than disrupting it. They demonstrated that standardized currency and predictable taxation enable economic growth. The Ming dynasty that replaced the Mongols in China adopted many of their administrative systems. The Ottoman Empire, which conquered much of the former Western Mongol territories, continued the tradition of protecting trade routes. The Silk Road flourished for another century under new management. Europe, which had been relatively isolated from Asian trade before the Mongols, became permanently connected to global commerce. Marco Polo's accounts of Mongol wealth and Chinese innovation sparked European imagination. The desire to access Asian goods directly, without Mongol or Muslim intermediaries, would eventually drive the age of exploration. The Mongol use of paper money influenced monetary thinking for centuries. While Europe wouldn't fully adopt paper currency until much later, the concept that currency could be based on state authority rather than precious metal content was revolutionary. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongols demonstrated that globalization, even in a medieval context, generates immense wealth. When goods, people, and ideas flow freely across borders, everyone benefits. When trade is protected and facilitated, economies grow. When different cultures interact, innovation accelerates. These lessons remain relevant today. Modern global trade follows the same principles the Mongols pioneered: safe shipping routes, standardized currencies, predictable regulations, and the free flow of goods and ideas. The mechanisms have become more sophisticated, but the fundamentals haven't changed. The Mongols understood something that many empires before and after them failed to grasp: true wealth isn't in the gold you hoard. It's in the trade you facilitate, the production you enable, and the networks you maintain. The Mongol Empire remains history's largest contiguous land empire. At its peak, it controlled more territory than any other power had before, and few have since. But size alone doesn't explain why they became the richest empire in history. The Mongols built their wealth on revolutionary economic principles: monopolizing trade routes, implementing paper currency, maintaining predictable taxation, preserving productive capacity, and practicing religious tolerance for economic benefit. These weren't just policies, they were a complete reimagining of how an empire could generate and sustain wealth. They proved that nomadic warriors from the steppes could not only conquer civilizations but could also build economic systems more sophisticated than those of the settled empires they defeated. They showed that the real power lay not in looting treasuries but in controlling and facilitating the flow of wealth itself. The Mongol economic system eventually collapsed, as all empires do. But the innovations they pioneered, the trade networks they established, and the lessons they taught about global commerce shaped the world for centuries to come. In the end, the Mongols became the richest empire in history not because they were the best warriors, though they were, not because they conquered the most land, though they did. They became the richest because they understood what wealth truly meant: the free flow of goods, people, and ideas across a connected world. And that lesson remains as valuable today as it was 800 years ago. Before you go, drop a comment. Which empire should we cover next? The Romans? The British Empire? The Dutch Golden Age? Let me know what economic story you want to hear next. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Empire of Wealth. We're building the ultimate library of economic history on YouTube, and I don't want you to miss a single episode. Thanks for watching.